When the popular and controversial game director Hideo Kojima left Konami in 2015 in a highly publicized and dramatic fashion, it was unclear what he had in store for the future. It didn't take long for him to bounce back with the independent reincarnation of Kojima Productions at the end of that same year. But what really shocked the world was how quickly his new project was shaping up. Death Stranding was revealed to the world just over half a year after his studio was revived, thanks in no small part to a partnership created with Sony Interactive Entertainment. This project drew a ton of attention for multiple reasons, such as the talent involved, a small collection of noteworthy actors like Norman Reedus, Mads Mikkelsen, Lea Seydoux, and guest appearances from film directors Guillermo del Toro and Nicholas Winding Refn. And that's on top of other talented names like Troy Baker, Tommy Earl Jenkins, Lindsay Wagner, Emily O'Brien, Margaret Qualley, and more. For a film buff like Kojima, who loves movies and making friends with figures from the cinema world, it wasn't that big a shock that he would attract such a cast. The other reason Death Stranding drew a ton of attention was its premise. While many people were expecting Kojima to simply make his own legally distinct Metal Gear right out of the gate following his rather toxic departure from Konami, Kojima himself felt that that would be way too predictable. Instead, he gave us something that, in typical Kojima fashion, would cause confusion just as much as it would garner interest. To put it bluntly, Death Stranding was a science fiction, open-world action-adventure mailman simulator. This reveal was head-scratching, to say the least, but Kojima is no stranger to potentially alienating a portion of his players. He's been doing it basically his entire career, especially with Metal Gear Solid 2's infamous main character switch, which some people still complain about over 2 decades later. However, when all was said and done, many of his most passionate fans, the people who actually want Kojima to be as weird and unfiltered as possible, for better and for worse, stayed on board. Finally, in November 2019, not even 4 full years after reopening his studio, which is insanely fast for a new AAA IP, Death Stranding released to mostly positive reception, but with a predictable amount of criticism aimed at its aforementioned odd and sometimes frustrating gameplay ideas, especially surrounding the act of simply walking from point A to point B. Personally, I ended up loving the game. It wasn't perfect, the opening hours were definitely quite slow, something Kojima himself admitted, and the script did not hold back when it came to his penchant for cheesy lines, lore dumping, and information overload. But the experience was still held together by amazingly directed cutscenes, strong performances, beautiful music by Ludvig Forssell, gorgeous art direction by Yoji Shinkawa, and a gameplay loop that truly rewarded players for actually trying to be efficient and thoughtful of future deliveries. I hadn't started making YouTube videos yet when the game came out, so I didn't write a review for it when it was new. But I did make a retrospective last year detailing my time with it, as well as why I ended up enjoying my second playthrough more than my first, which I honestly didn't expect. I always feared I would enjoy the game less on a second playthrough, but the game proved that my fears were unfounded, and a second go at it actually made me appreciate it even more. If you're interested, a link is in the description. As the months and years went on following release, the game's somewhat split reception would slowly turn around to be more positive, especially when the real world was struck by a pandemic that forced many people to isolate themselves, which is a core theme of the game. As divisive as Death Stranding was, I found myself constantly thinking back to it, because to me, it felt like the purest game a developer could make. It felt like it was made with no concerns whatsoever about reception, budget, or deadlines, despite how quickly it came out. Kojima and his team had a very specific game in mind and made what was exactly pictured in their heads, without needing to fret over mass appeal. At least, that's what it felt like. I spent years wishing more studios could be able to make a game in such lenient conditions. Just make ambitiously weird and unfiltered shit on a blank check for the sake of it. But sadly, only very, very few are given that opportunity, and even if they were, not all of them have the focused management to actually put out a finished product. Some studios, when left to their own devices, get caught in an unending loop of increasing scope. Now, nearly 6 years after waiting, we finally get a follow-up, and it looks to be even more ambitious than its predecessor. It seems to have more of everything. More cargo to deliver, bigger regions to hike across, more chances to engage in combat, more equipment to unlock, more preppers to meet, and of course, more characters to drive the grander narrative forward. So the question now is, does this larger scope improve the experience or not? Well, I bought the game, I played it, and I finished it, and now I want to talk about it. Before we dive into the review though, I do have some advice to give. I assume that one or two of you watching this review might be doing so without having played the first Death Stranding, and you're considering picking it up if the sequel ends up sounding good. And I have a couple comments on that. First, yes, I recommend playing the first game before playing Death Stranding 2. There's some big plot details in 2 that either recontextualize or require knowledge from the first game, and it is assumed that you understand what's being talked about. Kojima is no stranger to this. You know this if you've played Metal Gear. So if you don't want to be lost in the finer details, play the first game. Second, if you do decide to play the first game, I strongly recommend that once you reach Episode 3 and enter the Central Region, you visit the Craftsman and Engineer preppers so you can unlock the Bola Gun and Power Skeleton, 2 of the best and most useful pieces of gear in the entire game. Some people give up on Death Stranding or unwittingly make the game harder for themselves because they skipped or neglected to use these and other useful equipment that the game wants and expects you to use. These 2 specifically, though, blow the whole game wide open early on and are the first major steps towards efficiency, so get them as soon as possible. And also, don't forget to build the roads. It's easier than you might think, so long as you keep it in mind every so often, and it genuinely helps making future deliveries go way, way smoother. Anyway, let's get all of this long-winded preamble out of the way and finally start with the review. Death Stranding 2 opens only 11 months after the end of the first game. Sam Bridges, played by Norman Reedus, is living in peaceful solitude with his child, the former BB named Lou. However, his former companion, Fragile, played by Lea Seydoux, finds them and asks Sam to help her with one more big job that only he can be trusted to do, as it always goes. Thus, Sam puts on the porter uniform once again and treks down into Mexico. Sadly, this job isn't a quick and painless one, because while he's gone and Fragile stays behind to look after Lou, she and the baby are attacked by a strange group of red-clad assailants. Afterward, Sam decides to take his chances with Fragile and her new team called Drawbridge to search for answers, with their journey taking them all the way to Australia. Of course, the story is far more complex than how I describe it here, as you might expect from a game written by Hideo Kojima, the mind behind the long and sometimes difficult to penetrate world of Metal Gear. But if there's 2 things the story has to offer in abundance, it's detail and excellent performances that drive home the emotional core of the narrative. To no one's surprise, the game's lengthy list of talented actors managed to sell every aspect of the world and plot with complete sincerity and gravitas. From the pleasant and sentimental opening with Sam and Lou to the more dire and serious scenes involving violent encounters and consequences, to the more pensive discussion scenes that focus more on unraveling the mysteries ahead, to the absurd and strange that make you chuckle or cock your head to the side in confusion, Death Stranding 2 is a story and setting that can get you to feel a whole gamut of things. The first Death Stranding was hyper-focused on the world itself, its history, the terminology, how society functions now, and new technology developed to cope with all the new and horrific dangers. It was fascinating to anyone who enjoys incredibly detailed world-building, which I do sometimes. But to anyone who is quickly worn out by constant lore dumping and information overload, it could be exhausting. In its position as a sequel, Death Stranding 2 doesn't have to spend as much time on that stuff anymore. There is still world building to be seen, but it's not as dense and seemingly unending as it was last time. Now, with the foundation already set, the sequel zooms in a bit closer to give a more personal journey involving Sam and his relationships with the people around him. The end result is a story that is much more human feeling compared to the first game's human element feeling a little less important next to the broader concepts of the setting. In Death Stranding 1, the more personal journey was there, but mostly focused in the final act. The story was about connecting the country together, but in 2, it's much more about Sam's connections with other individuals, and that theme is perpetual throughout, from beginning to end. And it's why the talent of the cast manages to shine more here than it did before. The main cast has closer relationships with each other now, and aren't just primarily lore dumpers. Now don't get me wrong, they still dump lore and jargon pretty frequently, but it's a more even spread now. And new characters are no less noteworthy. The members of Fragile's Drawbridge crew, Tarman, Dollman, Rainy, and Tomorrow, is a travel party that's easy to get along with, and they each have their own unique story that drives them to navigate this hellish world just as much as Sam does. You also have more mysterious players like the president of APAC, a shadowy corporation that likes to control things from behind the scenes, and Neil, who many have dubbed Not Solid Snake. He basically takes the place Mads Mikkelsen had in the first game as a periodic foe that you slowly learn about through your encounters with him. Everyone gives a serious effort here, with everyone serving a key purpose that pays off when the story needs it as you approach the game's climax, which is even more ambitious than I assumed it would be. No details though, since this is a spoiler-free review. I'll just say that it gets heavier and heavier with big, grand imagery as it gets closer to the end, and if you're not just soaking in the vibes, it's only going to be perplexing. If there's any criticisms I have about the story, it's that there are particular pieces of information that are very easily predictable, especially if you're really dialed in with how Kojima tends to write his twists and turns. This can be kind of frustrating because it is a long game, so it takes its time reaching a conclusion that you might have thought was obvious already a few dozen hours ago. Thankfully, the story doesn't really hinge exclusively on the impact of these twists. It's still about the personal journey of connection first and foremost, so as long as you're invested in that character-driven aspect, it's still an engrossing narrative with many emotional high points. There's also Kojima's penchant for slipping in constant goofy jokes and gags into serious encounters and scenes, as well as his habit of skipping over the middleman of subtext and diving straight into the matter. Some people, especially those who think storytelling should not be allowed to do those things, might be vehemently against those qualities, but not me. I can still enjoy and respect some tonal whiplash as long as it feels sincere and fully committed. And if Kojima's writing can be described in any way, it's those two descriptors. Because when Kojima writes, he is unashamedly himself. And you'll simply have to take it or leave it. And for me, I'll take it. All of this isn't to say the actual world is any less fascinating compared to the first game though. The setting of Death Stranding is still loaded with developments that have happened in the 11 months since the end of the last game's story. There's still a ton of new concepts to learn about and a ton of fictional science to read up on. The world is crammed with pure nightmare shit the more you uncover about it. Just like before, people are still terrified of stepping outside because of an enemy most of them can't see. And anyone who perishes for any reason in this world has to have their bodies properly disposed of because their corpse is a ticking time bomb that can level a whole city. Oh, and there's rain that ages you for every drop that touches your body. But things are getting even worse, with more shadowy groups and companies popping up to take advantage of the quiet chaos. Robots replacing human porters in the UCA, more people being afflicted with syndromes that manifest in some debilitating manner every 21 minutes, plate quakes shaking the ground beneath your feet with regular occurrence, and a very dire illness called still baby syndrome, which turns expectant mothers' wombs into a timeless realm where their unborn children are stuck in limbo, alive but unmoving and ungrowing. On the surface, the world seems quiet and almost serene, but it's because people are scared and suffering horribly away from each other's notice. The entire narrative of Death Stranding 2, both the foreground and background stuff, manages to shift focus without sacrificing what made the first game interesting and enjoyable to the people who liked it. Then you have the actual locations, Mexico and Australia. The former serves as more or less the tutorial area like the eastern region of America did in the first game, and the latter is where the vast majority of the action is going to take place. Despite its small size, Mexico is decently varied in geology and biomes. Obviously, it's mostly desert, but there is a patch of jungle, the small remains of a city, and a small mountain to climb at the southern end. Australia, on the other hand, is absolutely massive and is mostly a mixture of wetlands, multiple different types of deserts, some green areas that are reminiscent of the eastern region in the first game, and a gigantic snowy mountain in the middle that takes up about half the map all by itself. And yes, it is a bitch to climb over if you're ill-prepared. When you have a game like this, where the challenge mostly comes from interacting with the environment more than fighting enemies, the map needs to basically be its own character, arguably the main character. The locations need to be painstakingly detailed to ensure you are constantly communicating with it, constantly being affected by obstacles to get over, whether it's rampaging rivers to cross, cliffs to scale, rocky paths to not trip over, or withstanding the new dynamic weather system. Those are the things you need to conquer in order to increase efficiency and create your own cargo delivering infrastructure. Some people who haven't played Death Stranding might not understand why a hiking simulator might be so interesting to some people, but it's because of the constant interactivity between player and environment. From tiny things like simply holding the trigger buttons to stay balanced when you're carrying 200 kilos of shit on your back, to big commitments like planning a multiple kilometer journey that requires use of numerous vehicles, tools, and weapons. There's plenty of antagonists in the story of Death Stranding 2, but your greatest nemesis as the player is always going to be the land itself. And it's land that also happens to be absolutely beautiful, which leads me to graphics and art direction. The game is powered by the Decima engine created by Guerrilla Games, who offered the engine as a gift to Kojima when he established his revived studio, and PlayStation took him on a world tour to meet their first-party developers, and it ended up being a match made in heaven. Kojima Productions were able to make a remarkably detailed and functional game with their first attempt at the engine, and Death Stranding 2 only follows that trend. The studio uses the strengths of Decima to such a degree that it feels like they've been using it for decades. I was a huge fan of how the world looked in the first game. It was simultaneously somewhat realistic, but also very embellished. It had a sort of exaggerated naturalism going on, as if individual pieces of the map look like they could really exist somewhere in real life, and some of them do, but the game stitches them together to create an environment that's really breathtaking all over. It was beautiful, and I'm glad to say that the sequel does the same. As treacherous as Mexico and Australia can sometimes be to navigate, both countries are undeniably gorgeous. When I first gained control of Sam at the beginning of the game, overlooking these staggered ridges of the Mexican mountains, it blew me away. Even though there's not a single bush or tree to be found, it's just the majesty of the landscape and its formation. On the flip side, there's the jungle, which is dense and lush and equally beautiful. The game looks as immaculate as the nicest tech demos for Unreal Engine 5, but this isn't a tech demo. It's a full, massive game, and one that doesn't even come with the usual performance hiccups that the biggest Unreal Engine games often have. The lighting and shadows of the game are also dynamic, accurate, and crisp. The game has a new time of day system where you can slowly watch the world change from day to night, with trees, buildings, and mountains all casting shadows dynamically that are sharp, not blocky and pixelated. When you're in a foresty area, you can see the sun poke through the canopy and between trees, lighting the green leaves and foliage up with noticeable vibrancy. When you're traveling around at night, you can spot the lights of far-off distribution centers and forts shining under the stars of the gorgeous skybox, creating a moody late evening scene every time. And what's crazy about this is that the game achieves these things without ray tracing. Death Stranding 2's approach to lighting and shadows is highly effective without being a burden on performance. And then there's character models, which is a whole other ballgame. It's a running gag online that Kojima loves to scan people, but man, those scans are incredibly detailed and faithful. I've seen a lot of games that fumble being able to make their characters look like they're actors despite also using facial scanning, but Kojima Productions has perfected the art of making 3D clones of their stars. When you see Sam, there is no mistaking that it's Norman Reedus. Same goes for Lea Seydoux as Fragile, Elle Fanning as Tomorrow, so on and so forth. It gets especially impressive during cutscenes with close-ups, which is where the fidelity becomes really impressive. There's no awkward, uncanny valley to jump over. You don't see these characters as weird wax sculptures or anything. You just see them as people. With accurate facial scans and precise motion capture, characters come to life in both gameplay and cutscenes. And speaking of cutscenes, they are incredible in this game. This shouldn't come as a surprise. Cutscenes have always been strong in Kojima's games, and as such, they are well captured and well directed in Death Stranding 2 as well. The placement and movement of the camera, the framing, the blocking, the lighting, the wide shots, the close-ups, high quality every single time. Kojima especially loves to give his antagonists cutscenes that have them exude aura. Higgs and Neil are made to look incredible, from their physical designs to how they're introduced and reappear later. Cutscenes are always legible, memorable, and easy to follow. And then we have the art direction. I already talked about the setting and environments, but we still have the technology inside the world of Death Stranding to touch on. I am a huge fan of Yoji Shinkawa. Ever since I played Metal Gear Solid all those years ago, I've adored his designs for machines, weapons, uniforms, and vehicles, and that adoration has stayed consistent this whole time. Death Stranding 2's sense of style is incredible. Shinkawa's aesthetics hit the perfect spot. His designs for all the technology featured in the game are slick and clean without being sterile and boring. They're stylized and recognizable without being obnoxious and gaudy. I wish I could own an actual vehicle designed by Shinkawa. Hell, I would own a refrigerator designed by him. From the porter suit and Odra deck that Sam wears, to the weapons he can carry, to the DHV Magellan itself and the huge distribution centers scattered around the map, and all the pretty neon lights and holograms to match, Death Stranding 2's art direction is just beautiful. I almost want to live in this world despite all the downright hellish things happening, just so I can be around functioning Yoji Shinkawa tech. He remains one of the best to ever do it. The final thing I want to touch on regarding graphics and art is technically gameplay, depending on who you ask, but I think it would be more relevant in this section of the video, and it is photo mode. I don't mess with photo mode very often. It usually requires me to be completely enamored with the game's style and direction to do that, and since I just gushed about the environments and technology in the game, that's what happened. So, for the first time since Ghost of Tsushima 5 years ago, I started to pretty regularly open up photo mode and stage some pics. And I gotta say, it is very easy to use and offers a ton of options to create a jaw-dropping image without being overwhelming. There's filters, exposure and contrast sliders, depth of field, a ton of different poses and facial expressions for Sam and Dollman, and also logos and taglines to decorate your image with. There's even the ability to create multiple light sources and set them wherever you please, so you don't have to waste minutes just staging the picture. You can also open it with a quick press of the DualSense touchpad. You don't need to navigate the pause menu first or anything, which some games do. If there's any aspiring photographers out there, or just people who want to make cool looking pics, it's worth messing around in. I am not a photographer, but I was able to make some neat images, entirely within the limits of the photo mode. None of these pictures I made were edited in Photoshop or anything. They were purely the result of the in-game photo mode. There's only two things I wish the photo mode had. One is the ability to rotate the camera on its own without orbiting around Sam, so you could point the camera up easier without pushing it into the ground first, and the ability to directly control the time of day. If you want to stage a picture at noon or at midnight, you have to actually pass time in-game. If these two features are ever added in an update, it'll be a truly excellent photo mode in terms of balancing options and ease of use. Now we can talk about the actual performance. I mentioned earlier that the game's lighting techniques are effective without destroying the frame rate, and that is true. In fact, it's so true that when I first started up the game on my base PlayStation 5, I decided to play it in quality mode just to see what it was like, and I ended up forgetting to ever change it to performance mode for comparison. Seriously. In quality mode, the game runs at such a rock-solid and unmovable 30 frames per second that I just never thought about the frame rate again, and it was on accident. It wasn't until after the credits rolled that I finally remembered that I needed to try out performance mode too. So if you're the type of person who's willing to play in quality mode as long as it's a stable 30, then fear not, because it is completely stable, almost abnormally so. That being said, when I did finally switch over to performance mode to check out that equally solid 60 frames per second, I noticed only a slight downgrade in actual image quality. The picture is a bit fuzzier and distant details might occasionally shimmer and flicker, but beyond that, the visual difference between quality and performance mode is not that big, which is a breath of fresh air compared to other expensive and visually demanding games that force a performance mode with an image so blurry, it's as if the camera itself took its glasses off. If you go with quality mode, you'll get a sharper picture and shockingly stable 30 FPS. If you go with performance, you get a stable 60 with only a bit of fuzziness. There's no real loser here. Both modes accomplish their goals without too much sacrifice. However, I have seen from other creators out there that if you have a PS5 Pro, then you don't have to sacrifice anything, because the Pro version's performance mode not only has a stable 60 frames per second, but it is visually indistinguishable from quality mode too, so you get the best of both worlds. And then we have loading times. I've stated on other reviews that fast loading on PS5 games isn't really news anymore, thanks to the glorious technology of SSDs. Even with that in mind though, Death Stranding 2's load speeds are utterly mind-boggling. When you start up the game and load your previous save, it takes only a whopping second and a half from the instant you press the continue button. This is so blazingly fast that even when the game has real-time cutscenes that smash cut to different locations a distance away from each other, it doesn't lag or judder or do any visible loading between those cuts. It is extremely impressive. I think the only pre-rendered footage the game ever uses is footage from the first game. That's it. This also applies to things like texture loading and texture streaming while running around in the open world. In a game this big, where you can see far ahead of you at pretty much any point, you would expect to see a decent amount of pop-in. And there kinda is some pop-in, but only if you're looking far, far off into the distance, perhaps deliberately searching for it. Otherwise, I don't think I've seen any egregious examples of near-distance pop-in at all in the 80 hours I played the game. The Decima engine is just a magnificent piece of software, and Kojima Productions is equally remarkable for being able to squeeze so much out of it in only 2 tries. Even though I like it when studios have their own bespoke proprietary engines, a small part of me kind of does want Sony to license the engine out, if only to see what other studios can pull off with it. Plus, it would be nice if fewer open-world games forced us to put up with Unreal Engine's various problems that still persist even years after UE5's release. I wish more games could both look and perform this good at the same time. Front to back, Death Stranding 2 is technologically impressive and makes the most out of the PS5, both the base version and Pro version. A common complaint about this generation of consoles is that it feels like no games fully take advantage of the machines they're on, but this game absolutely does. And as the last part of this entire production value section of the review, we have music and audio. If you've played Kojima games before, and especially Death Stranding 1, then you know the tunes are finely crafted to match the action, the mood, and the emotions of the game. And I'm talking about every type of music. The original score, composed by Woodkid and Ludvig Forssell, licensed music, and new music basically commissioned for the game from collaborators, like the track On the Beach by Caroline Polachek or the returning Death Stranding by Churches. All of the music in this game hits, and the needle drops specifically are powerful. As an open world game, you have to pick and choose the right spots for your needle drops, because if you pick wrong, the player might accidentally skip it or at least make it shorter than intended. Thankfully, Kojima picked near-flawless spots to start playing each track, and the vibes are immaculate. I wouldn't necessarily say that any of the needle drops here are better than when Asylum for a Feeling started playing for the first time in the last game, but there's some solid competition. The artists that Kojima reached out to fill the game's curated soundtrack are excellent. There's Magnolian, a singer-songwriter from Mongolia, Gen Hoshino and Daichi Miura, a singer-songwriter and pop sensation, respectively, from Japan, and then you have Woodkid himself contributing a huge chunk of tracks. Many of them are somber, introspective, and personal, and thematically relevant to the journey we're presented and participate in. And then you have Usada Pecora's Peko Random Brain, which is suited for more specific situations, like blitzing around in the boost skeleton. And then there's sound effects and mixing, which is just as important to the beauty and atmosphere of a game's world as the visuals itself. In some cases, even more important. One thing that Kojima and his team have always been good at is making memorable audio cues that your brain absorbs and learns to instinctively recognize. For example, the most famous of these cues in Metal Gear Solid is the ringtone of an incoming codec call and the abrupt, blaring exclamation sound of an enemy spotting you. Death Stranding 1 and 2, by extension, have a ton of these sounds, from the beeps of Sam's suit detecting rain and automatically putting the hood up, to the Odradek scan getting a snapshot of the environment around you, to the interior of a distribution center lighting up in preparation for your arrival, to the almost addictive words of encouragement from signs that other players put down. The sound design of the game is just as distinctive as the visuals, but this time around, the audio design and mixing is accompanied by new weather and hazards, like dust storms that oppress your ears just as much as they oppress your eyes, and avalanches on the mountain that strike a brief explosion of fear when you see and hear it thrashing down to you with increasing volume. The sound effects of Death Stranding 2 are extremely crisp and immersive. It's a hell of a sonic experience if you're fortunate enough to have a good surround sound system for your gaming setup. I know a lot of people don't typically play single-player games with headphones on, but if you are someone who does, this is a game that will make it worthwhile in that respect too. And now, it's finally time. With everything else out of the way, it's time to get to the real meat and potatoes of Death Stranding 2. The gameplay. To put things bluntly, Death Stranding 2 is a very mechanically dense game, especially if you go out of your way to use every tool and explore every route available to you. The more you dive into its systems and the more you try to accomplish, the deeper the experience gets. This was already true with the first game. Anyone who actually tried to employ clever use of the equipment, structures, and weapons they had access to will tell you as much. But the sequel does the smart thing of simply giving you more of it. In the lead up to the game's release, a lot of people who were able to get their hands on it to preview it compared it positively to Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain, because it too was an open world game with a ton of ways to approach your missions. You could absolutely stick to a small set of equipment you're most familiar with and reach the end of the game that way, but a lot of the fun was found in experimenting and learning how to master everything, and that's exactly the same here in Death Stranding 2. Tools and gear are in incredible abundance here, and messing around with them on your way to establishing connections and infrastructure is the lifeblood of the enjoyment. A lot of die-hard porters who loved playing mailman in the first game were concerned that delivering cargo would play a significantly smaller role in Death Stranding 2, but that's not the case. While yes, combat is more common now, to the point where it's almost as routine as delivering, it doesn't change the fact that delivering is still the backbone of the gameplay, and embracing those systems instead of treating them like a trap you need to ignore to get to more story is the actual key to enjoying and appreciating the game. The otherworldly BTs and the human brigands do make their return as common enemies, plus a third enemy group of armed robots that's even more dangerous. You have a ton of weapons to dispatch them in any way you like. Assault rifles, sniper rifles, shotguns, grenade launchers, pistols, tranquilizers, melee weapons, or just good old-fashioned fisticuffs. But even then, the number of ways you can conquer the land as you make your deliveries is greater. Use ladders, ropes, and bridges to cross over smaller hazards. Build timefall shelters to protect yourself and your cargo from timefall and repair any existing damage to your containers. Put up watchtowers to examine your surroundings and tag potential enemies or lost cargo to grab. Build a charging station to juice up your vehicles or your exoskeletons. Or if you want to cover distance in style, or just have fun, build a jump ramp so you can run Sam off of it and do sick flips in the air. You can even grab Dollman off of Sam's hip and throw him into the air to look around the immediate area from height. Seriously. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Sam isn't confined to just his own 2 feet either. You can fabricate vehicles, but ideally, you also want to build roads to drive them on so going from point A to point B is smoother. However, building those roads requires a lot of materials, so you're also going to want to build monorails that deliver those raw materials to major distribution centers. But if you want to do that, you have to find and activate the various mines that generate those materials in the first place. This is where the infrastructure building part of the game comes in. The roads and monorails are at set points around the Australian map and serve as the main arteries of your network and provide a massive boost in efficiency once they're built. While the structures you build on your own using your PCC are the veins that branch off of those arteries. It's entirely up to you how you want to modify your map to suit your delivery style, particularly when it comes to recipients who aren't right next to any roads or monorails. Death Stranding is one of the few open-world games to actually justify being an open world, because the lion's share of interactivity is actually with the world itself. In basically all other open-world titles, the map is just the location where major events happen, and you're just traveling from point to point where those events occur. But in Death Stranding, you can directly affect the world around you and use that to your advantage in damn near every objective you need to accomplish. However, even with all these new and returning mechanics and toys in mind, Death Stranding 2 does have some of its own pitfalls regarding challenge, because the maps are geologically smoother to traverse and the extreme weather system doesn't fully make up for it. I'll discuss those more when we get to them. Let's go into detail about deliveries first. On the surface, the general idea is very simple. You're at a prepper's home or a major distribution center or fort, you pick up an order at a terminal, you're given your cargo and the chance to fabricate any equipment you might need, and then you're off. If you want, you can even manually chart your route using the game's map. All of that is pretty straightforward. You don't necessarily need to go deeper than that if you don't want to. But if you do, things get more interesting and the usefulness of bespoke loadouts per order or per route become more apparent and important. The more questions you ask yourself about the order you're about to pick up, the more you're considering the journey ahead and how to be properly prepared. How heavy is the cargo I'm going to be carrying? If it's light, how much extra equipment can I reasonably give myself and stay on foot? If it's heavy, will I be better off using a vehicle or floating carriers? If I do use a vehicle, will a trike suffice or will a truck be necessary? Are there any roads from here to my destination that are already built? If not, is the ground at least smooth enough for a ride that isn't horribly bumpy? If it is bumpy, would I be better off staying on foot and just equipping the best exoskeleton I currently have available? Can I pick up more orders on the way? Will the optimal route take me through enemy territory? If so, is it feasible to just go around them without wasting too much time? Is the area I'm going through already on the chiral network? If not, should I double up on extra batteries? Maybe bring a PCC to build a structure at the very edge of the network before I go into uncovered territory? Does the order have special conditions like keeping the cargo cool, keeping it flat? Is it extra fragile? Or is it hazardous if it suffers any damage? It's honestly not all that different from the loadout process from Metal Gear Solid 5, where you picked out your equipment on a mission-by-mission basis. Even back then, it was basically split into two camps. People who just grab their most reliable go-to stuff and get a move on, and people who really do sit there for 5 minutes and imagine every step of their mission ahead. Both approaches are viable, and while it's possible to have fun either way, I think there's more to be had when you mess around with everything. And there's more stuff than ever to mess with. Mexico and especially Australia combine to make a gigantic playground for infrastructure, and with that size comes more potential recipients, called preppers, to give you orders. Just like the last game, as you repeatedly process orders and finish them, your connection rank with the prepper who receives that order goes up, reaching a total of 5 ranks. Each rank gives you a reward of some kind, and almost every single rank for every single prepper is some type of piece of equipment. Someone will give you boots that are more rugged and will help you with balance. Someone will give you a hologram grenade to trick enemies into attacking it. Someone will give you a tranquilizer handgun. Someone else will give you a new type of porter suit that cannot be picked up by traps, so on and so forth. Before long, you are drowning in gear to equip or take with you on the road. There's also the return of backpack attachments, ornaments that can do a variety of different things. They range from extra battery power for Sam's exoskeletons to an anti-gravity device that slightly lightens the weight of your cargo, to extra magazines of ammunition in case you intend to clear out an enemy camp, and more. If you don't want to use any attachments that make things easier, or you only have a small amount of space you can't use, you can equip different patches purely for the looks. You can even attach up to 2 keychains that give more bonuses and effects. I mentioned exoskeletons before. There's the Battle Skeleton, which provides increased defense, the Boost Skeleton, which provides a huge increase in sprinting and jumping, and the Boca Skeleton, which is all about better balance and handling rough terrain. All skeletons provide an increase to the maximum weight Sam can carry, but it varies depending on the model. You also have structures you can fabricate with the PCC, which brings back everyone's favorites, generators, zip lines, shelters, and more, along with some new structures like the transponder, which enables fast travel, and the hot spring digger, which allows you to create your own hot spring wherever there's a water source. Variety and options are definitely high, but this also leads to one question: how is the challenge? Or more specifically, how is the challenge when you're making deliveries on your own 2 feet? This is a conversation that I've seen around social media since the game's release, and there's one particular talking point that's risen to the top, and it's geological challenges. There's a sentiment that's begun to spread that Death Stranding 2 is easier than 1, and it's not because of the greater variety of equipment, it's because there's a lack of more rigid sections of the landscape that absolutely force you to use specific equipment. And to be honest, I only half agree. I agree in the sense that it is a bit easier, but I disagree in the sense that Death Stranding 1 was not all that hard either. I replayed the first game only about a year and a half ago, which led me to making my retrospective I mentioned at the beginning of this review, and I completely breezed through it. There's only 2, maybe 3 spots in the whole central region of Death Stranding 1 that really push you to stay on foot. But even then, if you're really committed, you can brute force your trike through them. Otherwise, you can go through those areas on foot normally, get them on the chiral network, and then instantly trivialize them with a couple well-placed zip lines or bridges anyway. So yeah, I would say Death Stranding 2 is a bit easier in terms of geologic difficulty, but it's not by much. There's still plenty of opportunity and reason to get out and fulfill your orders on foot. Most of the map is accessible to your vehicles, but that doesn't mean it's the best way. Your vehicles can somewhat handle terrain that's covered in rocks slightly larger than Sam's head, but some people might prefer to just avoid potential driving and control annoyances by just walking. And frankly, some of you are absolute freaks of nature who insist on never using vehicles ever, because staying on foot as often as possible is just more fun, even if it means your orders take 10 times longer to complete. But I respect it. You guys are sickos, but I admire the sickness. More power to you. That being said, I do have a handful of mostly light criticisms regarding the other aspects of the game's delivery challenges. First is getting your connection with preppers to rank 5. Now my issue with this is how uneven it feels. There's many instances where getting a prepper up to rank 4 is actually very, very easy. But fulfilling that final star to get rank 5 suddenly slows to a complete crawl. In the worst case, it takes more orders to get rank 5 than it did to get ranks 1 through 4 put together. This puts players in a pretty unfortunate position where, if they want an early or mid-game prepper to reach rank 5, they have to either repeat the handful of standard orders they have access to multiple times, all of which have cooldowns after they are finished, plus go out of their way to pick up lost cargo scattered around the map for scraps, or progress the story for several more hours to unlock more preppers further away to get longer distance orders that likely move the connection gauge up more on a per order basis. Now on paper, I do not mind each connection rank requiring more effort than the last, but more often than not, the jump in requirements that occurs when you need to get that final rank is incredibly high and makes some preppers very annoying to max out. It's pretty aggravating when you haul 200 kilos of cargo up to someone who lives in a spot away from the roads where vehicles have decent trouble getting to, and you see that 5th connection star fill up by only 10 to 15% or so. It's difficult not to let out a sigh at that. I made a quick and dirty exponential growth chart to show you what I mean. Now, I'm not saying this is what the actual numbers are, I'm only saying that this is what it feels like. And to make matters more confusing, sometimes they don't even give a noteworthy new piece of equipment for that 5th star anyway, so you can't help but wonder why it was made so difficult to get. Similarly, my second, fairly nitpicky criticism is how insanely expensive roads can get near the end of the game. I mentioned the monorails are intended to help build the roads by moving huge amounts of materials, but man, even after mining 6,000 to 8,000 metals and ceramics, I still completely burned through all of it crazy fast. The monorails are cheap to build, no question. You can fill up your off-road truck with resins and alloys, and it's enough for the next 10 to 15 sections of monorail track. But if you're in the latter half of the Australian map and you completely fill up your truck with metals and ceramics, it's only enough for maybe 3 sections of road, and that's after other players contribute half or more of the necessary amount. For the first half or 2/3 of Australia, the road expenses are not that crazy, but when I was finishing up that last stretch at the very south, I was needing up to 3,000 ceramics for each section, which is about 10 times more than what I was spending at the start of the game. I'm not saying roads should be as cheap as the monorail. I think it's perfectly reasonable that roads are more expensive. But the inflation you see as you get further into the game gets pretty crazy. The growth chart I showed a minute ago when talking about the 5th connection rank for preppers honestly applies here too. Basically, when it comes to both of these metrics, the road materials and the connection ranks, I think the floor should be lifted, but the ceiling should be dropped a bit, so the climb is less steep and backloaded. Now those two things are my more nitpicky criticisms. They do bug me a little bit, but they're not that big of a deal at the end of the day. My next couple criticisms, though, I think are a little more important. First is a lack of orders with special conditions. I mentioned them a little bit ago. Orders where you need to keep cargo cold or flat, or be extra careful because they're super fragile, or they release toxic fumes if the container is damaged, or you have to deliver extra quickly because it's timed. These special orders exist, and some of them are plentiful. For example, there is quite a few orders with extra fragile cargo. I haven't crunched the numbers, but it's probably the most popular special condition. And I would say there's probably an adequate amount of timed express deliveries too. The rest, however, are far more rare, and it's kind of a shame. There's 400 standard orders, meaning optional, non-story critical orders, in the entire game, which is already fewer than the amount in the previous game, and only a handful have those extra interesting special conditions. It feels like a bit of a wasted opportunity. I would have hoped that Deliveries became more creative and interesting in the sequel, just as equipment variety did, and it somewhat accomplishes that, but not as much as I would have liked. And after that is another problem. There's not enough interesting weather. The marketing for the game highlighted things like dust storms, floods, and avalanches, but they're not really there. Floods happen pretty often, but they're nowhere close to being a real threat. I've experienced 3 dust storms in my 80 hours of the game, and I'm pretty sure 2 of them were scripted. And I've experienced 2 avalanches while on the mountain, and that's not too bad. That's a frequency of about 1 every 2 hours or so you're up there. Otherwise, floods and dust storms are either not much of a threat or barely existent at all. And I would say this is more disappointing than a lack of geological challenges. Oh, and there's also wildfires, which I completely forgot for a moment because I encountered 0 of them after the singular story-related scripted one. It feels like extreme weather and natural disasters were supposed to be a replacement for those geological challenges, but because it's such a rarity or non-threat, the game now lacks 2 major ways to make deliveries more difficult. And, as I expected, while going around and looking at discussions of the game, this ended up being the one major issue fans of the first game have with the sequel, and is arguably the only thing that feels like a downgrade. Now next, we have combat, and as I mentioned before, there's more of it this time around, or at the very least, more opportunities for it. Just as you prepare for your deliveries per order, you can also prepare for any potential foes you might encounter while en route. There's 3 major categories of enemies in Death Stranding 2. Brigands, or mules, the human enemies of the game, BTs, the entities from the beach that, if they catch you, throw you into a fight with a boss that you can either tackle or run away from, and robots, unmanned entities with powerful and lethal arsenals. As for how to deal with all these enemies, this is where the game makes some pretty big changes and improvements to your potential weaponry. First is cleaning up the unnecessary presence of lethal weapons. In the last game, even though it is constantly beaten into your head that actually killing human foes is a bad thing, because it can cause a void out that destroys everything in the vicinity, the game still, for some reason, gave you the ability to use guns with normal, lethal ammunition. I played through Death Stranding twice, and I don't think I ever pulled the trigger once on a gun with lethal ammo. Actually killing someone was a stupid thing to do 99% of the time, with the remaining 1% being times where you wanted to do it on purpose to turn the immediate area into a crater. Because, like I said earlier, corpses in this setting need to be properly disposed of or they'll explode like nukes. Death Stranding 2 makes the smart decision to just throw lethal weapons out the window almost entirely. They do still exist, but they are rare, and basically impossible to use on accident. Kojima mentioned before that the studio had data on how often people used each piece of equipment, and I would absolutely bet that damn near no one touched lethal firearms. As a result, the sequel goes all in on making a huge variety of non-lethal firearms to play with. We have the returning bola gun, plus handguns, assault rifles, shotguns, grenade launchers, sniper rifles. The whole collection is here, and there's multiple variants for each type. If you want to maximize ammo count, you stick with the normal version, but if you don't plan to be a one-man army and want to stay light, then there's a lightweight version that sacrifices ammo for space. There's also silenced versions of certain weapons, and some shotguns and assault rifles have their own grenade launcher attachment, in case walking around with a full-sized grenade launcher is kind of overkill. The great thing is that the majority of these weapons are labeled as multi-purpose, meaning that they do damage to all categories of enemies: brigands, BTs, and robots. This is a great convenience because you don't have to weigh yourself down with multiple weapons just to have one that handles each category separately. Now that being said, some weapons are more effective for one enemy than the others, so depending on your order, that might still be something to keep in mind. Alternatively, if you really want to be a badass, you can stick entirely to melee or even hand-to-hand combat. Seriously, there's electric rods and a boomerang that Sam can throw and have it fly back to him. There's also combat gloves that don't take up any space on Sam because he just wears them like normal, and they're actually pretty damn strong and useful. In fact, Sam has a special control scheme for hand-to-hand fighting that allows him to block and dodge like an action game character. It's pretty fucking sick. And it wouldn't be a Kojima game without some gag or gimmick weapons, but I won't spoil those. I'll just say they are pretty great in their own right. Just like with delivery equipment, combat equipment has an impressive variety that covers all bases, and they're all useful or at least fun to mess around with. The process of combat out in the open world is basically what you would expect. Enemy encampments and locations are marked on your map, with BTs and robots being designated with only a single icon, but brigands have their entire territory outlined in a yellow border. And these enemies are more interesting to fight because not only are they somewhat coordinated, but they change and evolve over time. What I mean by that is, if you allow a group of brigands to go on too long without any resistance, they'll become stronger. They'll start using better weapons, they'll start wearing thicker and more protective armor, and they'll start using vehicles more often, including decking out their trucks with automatic sentry guns. If you want to prevent them from becoming a problem, you'll need to head out into their yard and give them a spanking. And after you do that, you're also free to completely loot their entire base, which also gets refilled with more stuff as time goes on. Just like the first game, combat is largely optional, but unlike the first game, I think the sequel does a better job at nudging its elbow into you and getting you to seriously consider dropping on top of brigand territory to kick ass and take all their shit. Sometimes it's just really fun to take a break from delivering cargo and go deliver beatings instead. If I have any criticisms about combat, it's less about direct gameplay and more about conceptual stuff. Specifically, it's the intimidation factor. I know this is partly a result of having played the first game twice through already, so this issue can't really be helped to an extent. But part of me is a little disappointed that BTs don't instill the same sense of fear that they did before. and the new addition of robot enemies don't really fill in that void, at least not completely. The latter are definitely a huge threat, especially in numbers, and certain types of robot enemies can ruin your day if you're not prepared. But it's not a scary enemy to encounter like the BTs in Death Stranding 1. I don't want to be too harsh on the sequel about this because this is something that's difficult to avoid without potentially going overkill on strong new enemy types for BTs. In fact, there are new enemy types, namely a larger humanoid BT with green eyes that can spot you from further off, and when they grab you, they don't take you to a boss, they just kill you and cause a void out outright. But other than that, combat does feel a little more streamlined here. Generally speaking, I would say fights are less impactful on a moment-to-moment basis, but in return, we get more gear and items to play with. I'm not terribly upset about that trade-off, but I do wish we could get both. Now, let's discuss the Strand system. When Kojima called Death Stranding a Strand game, it was partially memed on, but as people played it, the concept was more understood. It's an online functionality that allows the cargo and structures of other players to appear in your game to help you out and give you more opportunities to succeed and make progress. Some people compared it to leaving messages in Dark Souls, and that comparison is on the right track, but the Strand system is actually much more robust, and the sequel really puts its foot down on that. To summarize everything, Death Stranding 2's Strand system is so reliably functioning and beefy that it's the closest you can possibly get to playing the game cooperatively alongside several other players without any of them actually being physically present in your game. If you decide to leave the system on and accept as much information as the game allows, other players' stuff will be everywhere on your map. You'll see lost cargo, structures, vehicles, weapons, everywhere. Not only that, but you can repair and upgrade each other's structures and build each other's roads. Furthermore, if you find yourself favoring the structures of a particular player, it's possible to go into your settings and create a social contract with them so that the game prioritizes showing their stuff in your world. Now, those who did not play the first game might be concerned that this means the game's world changes even while you're not logged in, but that isn't the case. From what I can tell, the game simply grabs information from other players' worlds and saves them to your world, where it will follow your progress on your save. Nothing changes while you're logged off. Structures don't deteriorate when you're not playing, so you don't have to worry about not playing for a couple weeks and coming back to an empty wasteland where you have to build everything all over again. Pretty much all of this was already present in the first game, but the sequel doubles down on its robustness. In fact, there's room to argue that the Strand system works too well, because my map is absolutely littered with signs and support requests. And this leads to the one tiny criticism I have of it. In specific spots, usually right in a prepper's front yard, there's an absolute mess of player info pop-ups, and I would really like an option to limit how many are on screen, or how close you have to be to see them, or a priority option, or a filter, something. I appreciate that the Strand system works insanely well, but I really don't need to see every tiny molecule that every player I'm connected to puts down. If Kojima Productions can give that one tiny quality of life setting, then I would say it's pretty much perfect. Speaking of quality of life, that's another spot where the game shines. There's a ton of tiny little tweaks and fixes scattered all over the game that makes equipment and structures more effective to use. The one specific tweak that I appreciate the most, by far, is the ability to set a curve to your zipline's connections. This means you no longer have to deal with obstacles preventing you from setting a zipline down. Just hit square or triangle while readying your placement, and you can set a left, right, or upward angled curve that gives an extremely huge amount of wiggle room. It's amazing. And it doesn't stop there. Multiple other structures get an additional feature or two that's comparatively big, like timefall shelters now refilling your canteen and protecting you from BTs that are chasing after you. Or post boxes not only allowing you to fabricate items, but also allowing you to hide inside them in case of an emergency. So not only are there more structures in Death Stranding 2, but the returning ones are even more useful than last time. It's incredible. Semi-related to this is vehicles, which I want to briefly mention because of their expanded customization choices. You can now attach more than just extra batteries to your vehicles, and especially your trucks. Both your trike and your truck can have anti-gravity modules that allow them to jump higher and provide a cushioned landing, and the latter can have a variety of auto-firing weapons mounted onto it, 2 at a time. One side of your truck can have a sticky gun that allows you to grab lost cargo without Sam even needing to get out, and the other side can have a machine gun or a cannon. Or you can double up on offense and have a machine gun on both, which is what I did, and it's actually viable as a brigand camp cleanup machine, so long as you avoid their electrified rods that can disable your ride. And as for post-game, it works the same way as the last time. Once the credits roll and the story is officially concluded, you're brought back to the game world and you're free to basically do whatever you want. You can deliver more, wipe out enemy camps to your heart's content, build any sections of monorail or road that you haven't already, anything. And if your post-game is still too easy, there's also a special toggle that lets you repopulate it with significantly more enemies. There's honestly so many more small, impactful mechanics that I can touch on, but I want to leave some of them for you to discover if you decide to play the game. And trust me, there is a lot more to discover. The game has its own encyclopedia called The Corpus, which has a section dedicated to explaining gameplay mechanics, and that section has over 170 entries. Overall, Death Stranding 2 is an incredible game with a ton to offer narratively, visually, musically, and mechanically. It's not completely flawless. It's almost impossible for a game of this scope to be so. It lacks geological challenge and does not fully fulfill its promises of extreme weather making traversal more interesting, which some people won't really be able to get past, though I do think one good update could balance things out. In the grand scheme of things, I find the game's shortcomings to still be fairly modest next to its immense strengths. The game delivers on a fascinating world that adds to all the lore presented by its predecessor, an emotionally robust story, beautifully directed cutscenes, strong performances from everyone on the cast, a gorgeous and highly detailed world, stylish near-future art direction, incredible music, and satisfying gameplay that is ridiculously heavy with variety and choice. There's no wrong way to really play the game. You can focus on efficiency and mastering the art of delivery, or you can go by vibes and either walk everywhere like a Porter purist, or stubbornly drive your vehicles over any terrain, refusing to get on your feet unless you really have to. You can build infrastructure as you go, restoring monorail tracks and roads alongside your story progression, or you can ignore it all for later. You can avoid enemy encounters or hunt them down with an impressive arsenal of weapons. You can stick to stealth and try to clear out camps without making a peep, or go in guns blazing like a one-man army. You can carefully map out your routes, or wing it and just go out with whatever gear is currently on your back. You can embrace the Strand system and accept a ton of help from fellow porters by using their structures and building your own for others to use, or you can turn the Strand system off completely and occupy your own world by yourself. You can use every piece of equipment to its fullest extent, or impose challenges on yourself to get by with minimal gear. Everything is viable. The only people who might have trouble adapting to the sequel's greater scope are those who prefer the more focused purity of the first game. I understand where they're coming from, but I don't fully agree with them. Not because I want less delivering or anything, but because if I want to deliver in a more pure way in Death Stranding 2, I can choose to do that. And I do choose to do that fairly often. I'm not as harsh on the game's lack of difficulty as other reviewers, because frankly, as someone who replayed Death Stranding 1 not terribly long ago, I found it to be pretty damn easy as well. I breezed through it with just about as little effort as I did with Death Stranding 2. blood grenades make BTs a joke, including bosses, a single bolo gun can clear out entire mule camps, and even the most difficult terrain can be instantly trivialized with 1 or 2 ziplines or even bridges. So I don't want to put the first game's difficulty on a pedestal, because it doesn't really deserve it. I enjoyed my second playthrough of it more than the first, but it also made me realize the game wasn't as treacherous as memories of my first playthrough made me believe. When Death Stranding 1 first released almost 6 years ago now, a lot of people were skeptical of Kojima Productions leaning into a strange direction of a mailman simulator. But as the years passed and its sequel released and doubled down on everything the first game did, I think going down this road has proved to be the correct decision. I'm glad Kojima and his revived team decided against jumping straight into a legally distinct Metal Gear IP right out the gate after leaving Konami. Instead, they made something actually different and, in true Kojima fashion, somewhat alienating. And I wouldn't have it any other way. I do not want Kojima to ever fully shave his edges down. As for the future, Kojima Productions has 2 projects underway that we know of. First is OD, a horror game funded by Microsoft, being made in collaboration with Jordan Peele. And then there's Physant, their actual espionage action game made with PlayStation, just as Death Stranding was. OD is still pretty mysterious. All we know is that it uses Microsoft's cloud gaming technology to deliver an ambitious new experience. Physant is also very early in production, and Kojima said that he expects it to be a culmination of all his work. But it is still another 5 or 6 years from releasing. So, as of right this moment, we've got a wait ahead of us for Kojima Productions' next project. Whichever comes out first though, I will be there to play it. This concludes my review of Death Stranding 2 on the beach. Thank you for watching, and keep on keeping on.